Welcome back to Gamers Talk Games. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button as we dive into some more fun Warhammer rules. Random and I just completed our first Combat Patrol League at our local game store. Random got third place, being the only undefeated player, but he did not have a chance to paint all of his models in time, which is what docked him some points. Sorry. During our league games, I heard a lot of questions about one of the most important things in the game, the terrain. Specifically, this question: how do line of sight and movement work with ruins and footprints? Random, can you explain?
Yeah, so there are a couple core concepts that you need to understand about ruins and footprints. So the first is if you are playing with ruins that are not on a base. So the ruin that we have here is mounted on a base. But if it weren't mounted on a base, you would need to discuss with your opponent before the game even starts, what are the edges of the ruin?
Mm-hmm.
What is the footprint of the ruin?
Mm-hmm.
Typically, if it's not mounted on a base, you would just kind of decide, well, it's where the walls, it's the corners of the walls or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's mounted on a base, that base is the footprint.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing that you need to do is discuss with your opponent if there are windows and doors, are those windows and doors considered open or closed? What you'll typically find in competitive play is that first floor walls, if there are any windows or doors, they're considered closed. If there are any floors or stories above that first floor,
Mm-hmm.
those are usually considered open. So if there are windows on the model, models can see through those windows, but that first floor is typically considered to be closed. So that means you can't see through the wall.
Right.
Okay. So now that we've established that, we need to understand the difference between within and wholly within.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to move some orcs to help us understand that. So we have our squad of commandos here.
Yep.
And the way that within works is if any part of the base, and this is one of those weird rules in Warhammer where the base is actually what matters. If any part of the base of any part of this unit of commandos is kind of crossing the border, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
of that footprint, that unit is considered within. But they are not wholly within. Because for something to be considered wholly within, the entirety of its base, or in the case of a unit, all of its bases, must be within the footprint.
Mm-hmm.
So as an example, right now, these guys are within.
Mm-hmm.
If this whole model were in, he as an individual model would be wholly within, but his unit is not they're not wholly within. They're
Mm-hmm.
just considered within.
Mm-hmm.
If everybody's base is all the way inside of this footprint, this unit is now considered wholly within.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to matter a lot when it comes to visibility.
Right.
So, for our first example, we are going to have this squad of commandos with no part of any model, with no part of any base over the border of the footprint.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And we're going to have a squad of barb gaunts on the other side. Now, even though logically we can draw a straight line between this orc and this tyrannid,
Mm-hmm.
they cannot see each other because the footprint blocks line of sight. However, once a unit is within, it can be seen. So, as soon as any part of his base, of this orc's base, is within the footprint, this barb gaunt will in fact be able to see this orc. The inverse is not true. Because this orc is not wholly within, and because this unit is not wholly within, they are not able to see through the borders of this footprint.
Okay.
Once this squad is wholly within, they are now able to see this barb gaunt. The other critical thing to remember is that these walls are still three-dimensional objects. So as an example, we have our orcs, who are now wholly within. And we have our Bargons. They cannot see each other because this wall has them separated.
Mm-hmm.
Even though these orcs are wholly within, they cannot be seen because the wall is still a three-dimensional object that blocks line of sight in the game world.
Mm-hmm.
So in our next example, we're going to move these orcs. We're going to place them on the second story, where there are, in fact, windows. And if you have agreed with your opponent that second story windows are open, then these orcs can now see out of the windows and shoot. They have line of sight onto these Bargons or onto the Psychophage.
Nice. But the Barbagants and the Psychophage can also now see them.
Correct. The Barbagants and the Psychophage can also see through the windows and fire on the orcs.
But they still get cover.
Anything within the footprint gets cover.
Nice.
So now we need to talk about how this works with movement.
Mm-hmm.
So for movement, what's really interesting is that models with the infantry keyword can basically ignore the wall. They walk through the wall as if it is not there. This is also true for models with the beast keyword. Every other unit keyword type cannot walk through the wall, but they can move through the footprint. So as an example, we have our Death Dread here. Our Death Dread cannot walk through this wall.
Right.
We'll turn this a little bit so the wall is more visible. So the Death Dread can't walk through the wall.
Right.
But the Death Dread can move through the rest of the footprint. So the Death Dread could move through right here where there is no wall, but there is still part of the footprint. This Death Dread can move freely through that area.
Which makes sense.
So I think that covers the basics of infantry and other keywords moving, seeing, and shooting through footprints and ruins.
There is one more important thing that we need to mention, though, specifically with models like the Death Dread. So let's move the model back here.
So you're talking about overhanging parts?
Yes, the overhanging parts.
Yeah, so this is an interesting exception to the rules. Normally, when you're talking about models in Warhammer, you're talking about the physical model. In the instance of interacting with footprints for visibility,
mm-hmm.
only the base matters. So if this Death Dread were turned like this, where his arm is very clearly crossing the border
mm-hmm.
of this footprint, he is still not considered to be within. Because for the purposes of being within a footprint, any model with a base, the base is how you make that determination.
Right.
Now, this is different for models that don't have a base, but I think we'll probably cover that in a different video.
Mm-hmm.
This is just kind of covering the basics of how models interact with footprints and ruin walls.
If you found this video helpful, be sure to like and subscribe for more Warhammer content here at Gamers Talk Games.